All right, we've made it to 2018. And, with every new year comes about new resolutions and things we want to do to become better people. In this case, be maybe better photographers. And so that's why I wanted to put this video together, was to share with you some tips to help kind of change things up with the way maybe you've been approaching your photography. This kind of stuff is important for everyone, myself included, to remember, because it's easy to kind of get into a rut and to look at things that aren't working and use those as excuses of why, maybe you're not shooting as much or your photography is not as good as you want it to be. So I went back into my photo archive and I thought about some of the trips that I took over the past few years to come up with 6 tips that I think will help. These are tips that I want to use for myself as well on trips I'm taking. I'm going in a few weeks to Abraham Lake. I just booked a trip to Detroit for some new urbex photography, which I'm very excited about. And when I go out places, a lot of times I just fall into a rut, especially if it's been a while since I shot anything meaningful. So I'm hoping these tips help you out, and I'm going to use photos along with the tips to illustrate what I'm talking about. All right, so let's start with the first tip, which is don't get hung up. Now, this is specifically for people who are traveling to popular touristy destinations. This idea came to me when I was looking through photos taken on a recent trip to Grand Teton National Park. So one morning I went out to shoot sunrise, and there was just that beautiful view of the Teton mountain range. And my first inclination, and my inclination for the next hour or so, was to just shoot the same basic thing. I would zoom in a little bit, but it'd be mostly the Grand Teton mountain range with a beautiful body of water in the foreground and trees and everything. But when I look back on my photos from that particular time, they're almost all the same. Just kind of, as every few minutes went by, the light changed a little bit, and that's great. Of course you want to be there for when the light is right, but what's important is to remember that there are actually other things going on and knowing when to stop and move on to them. So once I was happy with the photos that I took at the sunrise, I switched my lens. I went onto a longer lens, and I found all these little things, these little scenes where there was like frost that was forming on little leaves, and I found this other leaf. It was awesome with this little hole in it, and I was able to get the sun bursting through it. So that's kind of my first tip, is don't get hung up on those big things. Get the shots you need, but remember that there are a bunch of other little things that will be very creatively rewarding. Trust me, when I finished shooting those, the little grass and everything, I don't know, all I remember was being very, very rewarded and just feeling that creative juice flowing. And it would have been completely different if I just planted my feet behind my tripod and just shot the same thing over and over again. I have way too many examples of that, and I suspect that many of you can relate to that. So that's the first tip. The second tip that I have is explore with panning. So what I mean by panning is, this is an ideal technique to use if you're somewhere and you're just not feeling anything, but you want to try to get something fun. And with panning, what you do is you find a subject that's in motion, that's moving through the frame, and with your camera, you pan or you tilt with them as they're going through the frame. Typically, I like to set my camera at about 1/20th or 1/30th of a second, sometimes 1/15th of a second, depending on how much available light there is. And then I'll adjust my aperture and my ISO to get that exposure. And I'll make sure that I'm looking for things that are moving. And this can occur pretty much anywhere. If you're in a field and there are animals, look for an animal that's running around. This is especially useful in cities because there are pedestrians, there are automobiles, there are all kinds of things. Or you can even get a plane that's flying through the sky. Again, the object has to be moving through the frame at a decent speed. If they're moving too slow, you won't be able to pan with them. So this is something that I especially love to do. I've done this wherever I travel. I've done it in Cuba, I've done it in New York City, I've done it everywhere. Just in Japan, I did it a bunch. And for me, I find that very creatively rewarding because it gives you a sense of life and excitement. The viewer looks at this photo, and if you do it right, if you pan at the right pace and you're synced up with your subject, the subject should be mostly, if not entirely, sharp, and then everything around the subject will get blurred out with motion. That creates a very dynamic feel. It's something that will get the juices flowing as well. Something I highly recommend. So remember, just set the shutter speed to somewhere between 1/15th and 1/30th of a second. And if it's very bright outside, you want to probably put on a neutral density filter, because you don't want it to be any faster or slower than that in order to get proper motion. So this third tip is for people who are just like, man, I have nothing to shoot. They don't have the opportunity to travel and there's just nothing to shoot. And I say, you know what? It's time to explore local events and local stores. When I lived in Portland, there were times where I couldn't look at another waterfall and I didn't have anywhere to travel to, but it wasn't an excuse for me to not shoot. And so every weekend or so, Nicole and I would go to the local farmer's market. Just an event, just kind of a few blocks from where we lived on a Saturday. And I would bring my camera and I would just focus on the beautiful produce that they had. You know, these vendors would come and they would lay out this fresh fruit and vegetables and just make it look beautiful. The colors were vibrant and just the surroundings were really nice. And in Portland, a lot of times it's overcast, so the light was nice and flat. But that served as a really wonderful place to just get some shooting in. And that's sometimes what it boils down to, is your camera does you no good if it's just sitting on a shelf. So even if it's just photographing fruit and vegetables, that's something. And then another example was, there's a store downtown called Cargo in downtown Portland, and it is wonderful. It's, I mean, a giant store filled with just, I guess, tchotchkes, just things that you would never expect to find, like a giant bin of little tiny dye. These little things offer all sorts of creative opportunities, and it's something I've visited that store many times, and I've always found something different. And I'll always just bring one lens with me in the store and see what I can do with that. So listen, odds are you can find something either at a local event or even at a local store and just make something out of it. And I promise you, if you do, just by going out and shooting, that will do wonders compared to if you're just sitting home staring at your camera sitting on the shelf. All right, my fourth tip is kind of a riff on tip number 2, which was panning. This fourth one is to introduce motion into your photos. Now with panning, you're actually moving your camera. But here, what I'm talking about is finding situations where your camera is still, but there is something moving through the frame. So instead of your scene moving and your subject being still, we're kind of flipping things around where your scene is still, but whatever subject you're focusing on is moving through. Now, this is also something where typically a shutter speed of anywhere from about 1/30th to half a second will be ideal. You don't want it to be too long of an exposure, especially during the day, because if the subject is moving too quickly, you might not even see it in the exposure. They just might have ghosted through. So you want a short enough exposure, you want the right light. But in these situations, I did this a ton on my recent trip to Japan. For me, when I think of Tokyo, I think of motion and moving because there's so many people and so many cars. So for me, a lot of what I did revolved around a theme of motion and movement. So something to consider when you're photographing is maybe, you know, not everything has to be perfectly sharp, but maybe try to get some motion to create a dynamic effect. And once that one gear starts turning, it'll turn other gears. And like I said, that creativity will start flowing, I promise you. Tip number 5 has to do more with focal length, and specifically shoot tighter. A lot of times we want to put on the widest angle lens and try to get everything we possibly can into a frame. But you know what? There's a lot to be said about focusing, refining, and eliminating a lot of the excess stuff, just to render it down to something very unique. So probably the perfect place to illustrate this is the Grand Canyon. For those of you who have visited, I would be willing to bet that you used a super wide angle lens. And trust me, I've done it too. The thing with the Grand Canyon is it is so massive that the wider your focal length, the harder it is to really convey a sense of depth and a sense of size, because everything is just super huge, and the further you are from your primary subject, the smaller everything appears. So that sense of scale is also lost. So I took a bunch of shots at a wide angle, but then I also made sure to put on a super telephoto lens and focus on specific details, you know, formations, to be able to convey the striation of the rocks, That gives you a sense of shape, it gives you a sense of distance, and it really does allow you to walk away with something entirely different than what most everyone else takes. And now we've reached tip number 6, the last tip for this video. When all else fails, when you're just, need something different, switch to some novelty gear. So what I mean by that is, I'm a big fan of infrared. I had an old original Sony a7 that it wasn't worth it for me to sell it to get a few $100s. Rather, what I did was I sent it in to have it converted to infrared, which is basically where an infrared filter is applied directly onto the sensor. And it's pretty much a one-way street, which means once you send it in to get that filter applied, there's pretty much no going back. You're not taking that filter off the sensor. But it breathes entirely new life into your camera, because infrared is it's a new universe for photography if you've never experimented with it, especially if you're shooting nature and even portraiture. Basically, if you're photographing anything somewhat organic, infrared does a really amazing thing in terms of black and white, that really beautiful silky black and white processing. So that's something to consider. Another thing to consider is trying out Lensbaby lenses. Those lenses are really unique, and they create interesting depth of field effects, interesting tilt effects, and it's just one of those things where if you're just tired of using a 16 to 35 millimeter lens or a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, maybe something like this, like one of these novelty lenses, can do the trick to kind of break out of any creative funk that you might be in and make you appreciate the world in an entirely different way. And so with that, I hope you got some inspiration out of this video. I hope it makes you excited to go out, try new things with your photography and grow, because listen, it's a new year. Use this as an opportunity to set yourself for some real growth, some real creative work, and just have a good time. So with that, please hit that thumbs up button. Let me know that you like this video. Let me know if you've got tips in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. I really appreciate it, everyone, and let's make it an amazing 2018.